Good evening, everyone. I'm Jackie Dominguez, one of ALF's National Senior Directors of Engagement, and I'd like to be the first to welcome you to the academic debates presented by the Planning Committee from Arizona and Utah. We are so proud of our teams, excited about our topics, grateful to our sponsors, and honored to have such an outstanding panel of judges alongside our esteemed moderator. We are grateful that you would take time out of your busy schedule to join us and hope you enjoy the evening. This academic debate is being delivered on the Zoom webinar platform and will be recorded. During the presentations, if you have a question, please hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen and click on Q&A. Then simply type your question into the Q&A box. For all other comments and to cheer on your favorite team, please use the Q&A box as well. Also, please note that this program is being recorded and will be available on ALF's YouTube channel for future viewing. As I mentioned earlier, we are extremely grateful for our sponsors. Our national sponsors are supporting the debates across the nation and include national gold sponsors, AbbVie and ASI, and silver national sponsors, Salix. Our national bronze sponsors are Alexion, Mallinckrodt, and Pfizer. Let's hear what our national gold and silver sponsors have to say.
Right now, millions of patients are suffering with GI disorders such as overt hepatic encephalopathy, irritable bowel syndrome, chronic idiopathic constipation, opioid-induced constipation, bowel preparation, and ulcerative colitis. At Salix, we have kept up with these unmet needs for more than 30 years by providing an industry-leading portfolio of high-quality products that address these conditions. Through our dedicated and innovative R&D team, we're also exploring potential new scientific breakthroughs, and we remain committed to important healthcare provider investments in education, charitable grants, and sponsorships. We will continue to invest millions of dollars in patient education and do our best to broaden access to Salix medications, because our mission to improve the care for GI patients continues today. For us, there is no finish line.
We are so appreciative of our sponsor support. We encourage you to thank them when you visit with them. Without their support, we would not be able to continue to fulfill our mission. I wanted to give a shout out to those who tirelessly dedicate themselves to the liver patients and caregivers, the Arizona Medical Advisory Council and the Mountain West Medical Advisory Council. Council member listings can be found on our website at www.liverfoundation.org. They meet quarterly to work with the ALF to provide education for healthcare providers and patients, addressing the unique needs of those in their communities. I wanted to thank the Planning Committee for tonight's debate, a collaborative between Arizona and Mountain West. We're honored to have the guidance of Dr. Juan Gallegos, Dr. Richard Gilroy, Dr. Manuel Rodriguez, and Dr. Anil Seetharam for this outstanding program. Before I introduce our moderator, I wanted to acknowledge our technology team, Barb Potter and Karen Irwin, and ALF national staff members, Nancy Clemens and Erica Bowder. We couldn't do this without their expertise. And now it's time to turn the program over to someone who really doesn't need an introduction. He is highly regarded by the local healthcare community and beyond. Please join me in welcoming our moderator for tonight, all the way from Chi-Town, Dr. Michael Charlton of the University of Chicago, a local, national, and international thought leader on the liver. Dr. Charlton will be saying a few words about the history and format of tonight's debates, including our interactive audience poll. We'll explain how you can help support the mission of the American Liver Foundation, how you can promote the debates through our social media, and he will introduce our esteemed panel of judges for tonight's debates. Without further ado, Dr. Charlton.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you everyone for attending tonight and to our sponsors for your tremendous support. I will say that I'm genuinely rooting for all the teams tonight. I spent nearly 20 years at Mayo Clinic, where there's a substantial presence in Arizona, of course. I have good friends at Banner and University of Arizona, and also spent 4 years in Utah. So I'm very familiar with the programs and the teams, and I feel like I'm among friends tonight. The academic debates have been hosted by the ALF for 18 years, quite some time. There's something which has become part of the academic landscape, but they started with the ALF, and they started in the Great Lakes Division. And now they've become a signature program, not just for the ALF, but also for the ASLD, and really enjoyed by everyone who attends them. I'd like to share a little history about this particular debate with the Mountain West Division tonight. So about a year ago, these teams and topics were identified. A lot of work went into preparing for the evening. Then unfortunately, due to a COVID outbreak, one of the teams was unable to participate. As a result, this particular debate was put on hold out of respect for the team, and we're excited to be re-hosting these debates this evening. So a start that was postponed, but not stopped. The topic and teams were selected by members of the ALF's Arizona and Mountain West advisory councils. Tonight, it's our pleasure to present two debates. The debate team members are mentored by senior liver experts who guide them on their research, presentation skills, and the ability to think on their feet, an absolute prerequisite for debating well. Each team will debate opposing sides of the assigned topic. It's important to bear in mind that the assigned topic is not necessarily a belief held by either team. It's a topic they've been assigned to present and persuade attendees and the judges of the correctness of the position that they've been. Our presenters will be sharing a PowerPoint presentation. They will have 8 minutes to present. Team members providing the rebuttals will not be using a PowerPoint presentation, but they will have 5 minutes to state their argument to support their case based on their team members' presentation and the points made by the opposing team. Each speaker will be closely timed. If at any time a presenter or rebutter exceeds their time limit, their microphone will be muted by our timekeeper, not by me, so no angry emails to me. It will be our anonymous but fierce timekeeper. The Q&A for each topic will occur at the conclusion of the presentation and the rebuttals. The judging panel consists of esteemed liver experts, and the Q&A for the first debate should also last just 5 minutes. And due to a change in format for tonight, it will last 15 minutes for the second debate. Remember, there's no right or wrong answer to each topic. However, there may be very strong opinions for one side or the other, which can often lead to, and hopefully will lead to, a very lively debate. We provided the criteria to the team members to focus on creating professional and well-researched PowerPoint presentations, to practice and refine their rebuttal skills through research in their assigned topic and position, and be prepared to show how quickly they can respond and think. To include an interactive component for our audience, I wanted to mention that there will be audience polling throughout the evening. Questions will be posted periodically, and we're hoping that you will take a moment to respond. Of course, feel free to cheer for your favorite team by posting a message in the question and answer box. The chat function will not be available, but the Q&A box is there for you to use, so please do. We'd also like to acknowledge the hard work of our teams and express our sincere appreciation to our sponsors, our judges, our timekeepers, the technology team, and of course, all of our volunteers. And as importantly, we thank you for joining us this evening. At the conclusion of the evening, all team members will be recognized for their outstanding work, presentations, and dedication to the liver community. As many of you know, the American Liver Foundation is celebrating its 45th year. Despite the pandemic and due to the resilience of ALF staff, our stakeholders, local leadership, and our partners, we stand strong in our commitment to provide resources to the liver community. The resources to ALF far exceed the excellent literature and information that's available freely on the websites. Virtually, ALF continues to provide opportunities to unite the liver community through events such as virtual walks, marathons, Cuisine for a Cause, and patient and healthcare professional education programs and conferences. Anyone who's taken the trouble to engage with ALF will be fully aware of its virtue. And I think for me, some of the most valuable parts are the networking and the communication that happens between providers at ALF events. There's really nothing else in that space. There has been a significant increase in callers to the ALF helpline and visits to the website, proving the relevancy of our information and services. And we take a leadership role in advocating on behalf of the millions of Americans living with liver disease. It's estimated that 100 million Americans currently have one form of liver disease or another. Most commonly, of course, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, one of the topics for tonight's debate. And they maintain a reputation of serving as the patient's voice. ALF is, of course, a not-for-profit organization, and as such, it relies on donations to carry out our mission. So please be as generous as possible tonight. Your support is really oxygen for ALF and everything that ALF does. Please help ALF to continue to provide resources to the healthcare community, to patients, and to caregivers, and the general public. And I encourage everyone to use social media throughout the evening and follow the debate's Twitter feed throughout the program at ALF Debates. That's at ALF Debates. Now, before I introduce our first topic and team members, it's my great privilege to introduce our outstanding panel of judges. These judges will join us at the conclusion of the debate to ask thought-provoking questions of our debate teams. Now, the panel of judges tonight are Dr. Richard Match from Arizona Liver Health, a program builder in his time for transplant and a towering figure in hepatology. And the same can be said for Dr. Neil Chernoff of Clinical Associates in Internal Medicine, LLC. Now, the first debate tonight is transplantation of the elderly patient. Should this candidate be offered liver transplantation? The pro position has been assigned to, not chosen by, but assigned to the University of Arizona, very appropriately, I would think, even if it's by luck. And the University of Utah, which happens to be the youngest state of the union, is going to be opposed to transplantation of the elderly should this candidate be offered liver transplantation. So I'm going to start by going through the case study. So this, as you can see, is a 70-year-old man referred for decompensated cirrhosis. 70-year-old males in Arizona, I believe, can still be employed or serve as Chippendales, so not that old, but old for the purpose of this debate. He was well until 6 months prior when he developed ascites. Previous medical history notable for long-standing diabetes mellitus, medications, just Januvia. Family history stated no issues whatsoever. The father lived until ripe age of 95, the mother slightly older, age 97 when she passed away. Social history, the patient lives with his wife, lifelong non-drinker, non-smoker, has 4 adult children who live relatively close by in the vicinity, so excellent social support. Chronic liver disease workups performed prior to referral, but with no clear viral, autoimmune, inherited metabolic, or other illness. So it's technically cryptogenic. Disease probably burnt out NAFLD. Patient had an episode of chest pain about 6 months previously. GI evaluation, small esophageal varices, mild portal hypertensive gastropathy, cardiac eval, unremarkable treadmill and stress test evaluation, performed very well in the stress test, stressed well. The course for the last 6 months, notable for MELD sodium creeping up in May was 15, June 16, September 19th, and October 20. The patient had had 1 hospitalization for hepatic encephalopathy, no clear inciting event or infection for this. Mentation now back to sharpness. The patients achieved this with simple lactulose twice daily. Ascites managed with furosemide and spironolactone, moderate doses, paracenteses monthly, serum sodium consistently around 130. Now, before we start the debate, we'd like for you to everyone to answer a quick poll, and the shift in this poll will be important for determining who seems to have conducted the better debate, not necessarily the greatest number of votes, but where the shift has occurred. So based on this case study that I just read, based on this case study, should this patient be offered liver transplantation? So please select yes or no. Very good. So initially, an overwhelming majority, 85%, are saying that yes, they would offer this patient transplantation. 15% would not. So this is the target for the 2 debate teams, to either increase the yes vote or to decrease or increase the no vote. Very good. Now I'm going to introduce the debate team. So presenting the position that this patient should be offered liver transplantation, this elderly patient, is the University of Arizona. Their mentor is Dr. Anil Seetharam. And the debaters representing the University of Arizona are Dr. Sakolwon or Babu Suchartlikitwong and Dr. Kelly Zucker of the University of Arizona. The University of Utah will argue that the patient should not be offered a liver transplantation. The mentors for this team are Dr. Juan Gallegos and Dr. George Rofaiel. Nick Baker, a research coordinator, has graciously agreed to represent the University of Utah, presenting and rebutting. A special shout out to Dr. Babu Mohan, who was unable to join us this evening due to travel. He, however, created the PowerPoint presentation.
Hello, everyone. Today, I will tell you why we should transplant this patient. So let me tell you a little bit about the background. So older population in the US is growing. US Census Bureau just released the projected number of older population to outnumber children in 2034 for the first time in US history. As you can see on the graph on the right, in 2034, there will be 77 million people older than 65 years old, and compared to 76.5 million people younger than 18. And the gap between these 2 groups continue to get wider and wider. Considering liver transplant in older population is eventually inevitable. People live longer, and it's not because we have genetic evolution, but because we have a better medicine. We know better, and we tackle the disease better. So the predicted life expectancy of adult age 70 to 75 is between 12 to 16 years. When we look at the median survival for patients with decompensated cirrhosis is approximately 2 years. As you can see, we have the gap between 10 to 15 years right here that liver transplant may provide a survival benefit in this group of patients. Now, what is the concern? So people may say in the older population, the outcome might not as good as the younger population. So let me show you this study. This is a meta-analysis of to look at post-liver transplant outcomes in the older adults compared to the younger group. It has almost 250,000 patients in this study. The forest plot on the right side, as you can see, either they use the age cutoff point of 65 or 70 years old. There's no significant difference in terms of mortality. And again, in this graph also shows when they use the age cutoff point of 65 or 70s, the graph plots between these two groups is not different. When they look at the post-operative complications, including vascular complication, biliary complications, or major infections, again, there's no significant difference between these two groups. Now, some people may say because the patient has NASH cirrhosis, they tend to have more comorbidities like heart disease or diabetes. This might also affect the liver transplant outcome. This is a very interesting study. It's a multi-center cohort study looking at the older liver transplant recipients older than 65 years old. The bar graph, the black color represent the NASH group, and the gray color bar graph represent the non-NASH group. As you can see, the bar graph with the asterisk, it shows that in the NASH population, they have more CAD, diabetes, or hyperlipidemia or hypertension compared to the non-NASH group. And when they look at the outcome at 1 year and 3 years, the graft survival between these two groups are not different. So now, up to this point, liver transplant in the older population, as I show you from the data that we have, has favorable or comparable outcome compared to the younger group. So the questions now come down to who should we select for the liver transplant? People say age is a number, and it's true because it's just a number and it does not always reflect the actual physiological age. When we see patients in the clinic for the liver transplant evaluation, we look at multiple factors, including MELD scores. And also we have this eyeball test, which means that the doctor look at the patient and we kind of get the sense or the idea if the patient's fit enough to go through the liver transplant. There's a group of doctors who try to make eyeball tests to be more objective and come up with the liver frailty index. It consists of 3 performance-based tests, including grip, chest stance, and balance. And the study shows that liver frailty index is associated with the red list mortality. And on the table on the right, as you can see here, the liver frailty index has more odd ratios compared to other parameters that we normally use, for example, age or MELD score. This is also a study from our center. We look at the frailty index in pre-transplant patient, and it's also a predictor of overall mortality and hospital readmission regardless of liver transplant status. There are also other performance scales that has been studied at, and again, for example, Kanofsky performance scale we can use this to predict post-op mortality after the liver transplant. And this is another study that looked at the sarcopenia by measuring the psoas muscle from the cross imaging. And again, this also related or associated with 1 year and 3 year post-liver transplant survival. So let's get back to our patient. As you can see, he's 70 years old, has diabetes, but he can achieve more than 3 mets on his treadmill, which means that he can run in a short distance or can climb the stairs. By the age, he's 70s, but for his physiological age, he is probably younger than that. And I think he's a good candidate for the liver transplant. And without cirrhosis, he would probably live 10 or 15 years more. So I think liver transplant can benefit him in this case. I would like to make several points. Decision for liver transplant should be individualized. Post-transplant survival outcomes in carefully selected older adults are comparable to the younger population. Chronological age should not be used solely to exclude patients from liver transplant. Instead, using physiological age is more accurate. I would like to propose using frailty index in additional to standard MEL score for liver transplant evaluation. And these are my references. And thank you, my family at University of Arizona.
Very good. Thank you, Bo. Outstanding performance. Let's turn my video on here quickly. Now, Dr. Nick Baker from the University of Utah has the substantial task of persuading us that this patient should, in fact, not be offered liver transplantation.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nick Baker from the University of Utah, and I'll be proposing why we should not propose this candidate for liver transplantation. Being no surprise to this audience of liver transplant professionals, liver transplant is the primary effective treatment for our patients with complications of end-stage liver disease. Since the first successful human transplant in the 60s, the refinements in selection technique and postoperative care have significantly improved our graft and patient survival. It's allowed us to expand criteria to Hep C and HPV positive and stenotic livers. They're really successful donors at this point now. That being said, we've seen the age in our transplant waiting list adults as well as those who are receiving transplant rise. You'll see on the graphs that are from the OPN SRTR data that those over 65 made up about 25% of our waitlist adults. And then as well as the graph below, the total liver transplants by age shows that we've seen a steady incline in those over 65 between 2006 and 2018. Now, I do feel like it would be prudent to understand what are we going to define elderly as before we move forward. While it is in the eyes of the beholder, from this brief systematic analysis, we're going to conclude that when we're referring to elderly, unless otherwise noted, it is an individual over 65. So our patient today, as has been noted well, 70-year-old male referred with decompensated cirrhosis. We would suspect that it's NASH due to a history of ascites and encephalopathy, though his diagnosis is cryptogenic, and his MEL score is of 20. So let's kind of understand this argument. As was mentioned, there is a tough task to come right now. A simple fact that will be well known to this audience is that the availability of organs simply doesn't match our need and the growing need for transplantation. This phenomenon is no different in liver transplant. This imbalanced need, combined with the medical and surgical complexity of liver transplants, really leads surgeons and hepatologists to propose selection criteria that will balance equity and utility. This may include recipient age and the consequential comorbidities that follow with that age as an important deciding factor when looking at potential offers. At the heart of this debate really is the likely outcomes that this patient would have should they receive liver transplant. Should the patient be offered liver transplant, we would need to consider the risk of the perioperative morbidity. Their age and diabetes diagnosis increases their risk significantly. In the case that the patient would tolerate transplant well, there would be an increased likelihood of postoperative complications as well. And finally, as patient and graft survival may be marginal, while transplant waitlists may vary from center and region, should the patient be on the waitlist for an extended period of time, their overall medical status may decline further, which would not only increase their risk, but their ability to possibly tolerate surgery. In the case of this patient with the MELD score of 20 and their ascites and encephalopathy well controlled via medications, they would likely place relatively low on our wait list. Now, they could possibly receive an extended criteria liver relatively quick in our region, but then we could further deduce what benefit would be possible should they receive that transplant. I say that it would not be favorable. So our patient, the first key factor that I will mention today is their age. In this prominent study by Durand and his colleagues, we are given insight into the post-transplant survival rate at 5 years in those over 70 compared to those under 70. As noted in each of the 3 studies analyzed, the gap between the 2 groups averaged about 12% in favor of the younger population naturally. While a survival rate of ranging between 55% and 68% may be considered successful broadly, we should really attempt to understand where would our patient fall within this range. With their comorbidities, I would argue that their benefit would compare unfavorably. Looking further into patient graft survival, we can see similar trends in our OPTN and SRTR data. Once again, I'll reiterate that the chances while the chances of 1 year or even 5-year survival may be acceptable to some centers or even the patient, this patient carries additional risk. This allows us to consider whether high fidelity to utilization may prohibit him from receiving an offer while he is still healthy enough for transplant. Now, I would like to touch on the cardiovascular risk that I've been mentioning prior. In this landmark study, we were given further insight into the cardiovascular risks in our liver transplant patients. Van Wagner and his colleagues at Northwestern utilized the OPTN database between February 2002 and December of 2012 to assess not only the prevalence, but the predictors of early cardiovascular disease, early meaning 30 days. They defined it as anything that would be considered arrhythmia, heart failure, myocardial infarction, and cardiac arrest, as well as stroke. And among these 55,000 liver transplant patients, they found that 3% of them died within 30 days due to a cardiovascular event. The leading cause of deaths behind that was infection and graft failure. But in their multivariate analysis, there were 6 specific covariates that were related to the recipient, most of them which our patient relates to. They included age, preoperative hospitalization, ventilator and ICU status, and MELD score. Our patient can be argued as a high risk under these covariates. Additionally, while age was not stratified in this study, we know that as age increases, so do comorbidities and their consequential risk to this patient. This chart you'll see will further affirm our impact that cardiovascular events are one of the main contributors to mortality and morbidity in our transplant patients. Next, I'll move briefly on to NASH and the likely decompensated NASH cirrhosis diagnosis. In the study on the European Liver Transplant Registry, where they looked at 69,000 liver transplant patients, they found that the hazard ratio for those over the age of 65, as well as having a MELD score of over 23, was significant. 10 further studies backed that up, showing that old age was a contributing factor. Once again, we'll come back to reviewing our possible outcomes of our patient today. Post-transplant survival in this patient may be favorable to some centers or regions, but this patient will likely face post-operative complications due to their age and comorbidities, including a likely NASH diagnosis. Post-transplant survival closely follows graft survival. Thus, this patient should this patient receive a liver transplant and then face graft failure, mortality would be imminent. This leads us to see whether this liver may be utilized in a patient that is less susceptible to the risks. Forgive me. Based on the research presented tonight, I believe that we should not present a liver to this patient as the risks outweigh the possible benefit. Thank you.
All right, that was excellent, Dr. Baker. I admire the fact that you're wearing a bow tie. Probably the first time I've seen that since I left Mayo Clinic. So thank you for that. Now we have Dr. Kelly Zucker from the University of Arizona to rebut the University of Utah position. Dr. Zucker, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the ALF for the opportunity to participate today. I'd like to propose a rebuttal to the introduction made by our competitors at University of Utah. As Nick Baker stated, there is indeed a severe scarcity of organs available for transplantation. A recent figure I've encountered stated there are roughly 15,000 individuals on the liver transplant list per year, and only 2,000 to 3,000 organs available. We do want to recognize this scarcity, and we believe organs should be allocated to the best matched patient, and this should be regardless of age. As my co-fellow, Dr. Suchartlikitwong stated, in the coming years, there will be a continual growth of the elderly population. By 2030, 22% of the population will be over age 65, and it's predicted that by 2050, 2 billion people will be 65 years and older. Additionally, the life expectancy of those aged 65 and 75 has increased to 19.1 and 12.1 years respectively. As this population is growing and life expectancy has continued to increase as we improve healthcare, I think our best candidate may indeed be someone in the population, considering it at this time and in the future, over 25% of the entire population may be in that elderly category. If we choose an arbitrary number and say no transplanting after this age, we're relegating a very large percentage of otherwise fairly healthy individuals to a severely shortened lifespan. Beyond the population of the elderly growing, the landscape of liver transplant is also changing. As Nick Baker stated, NASH does have certain complications that are addressed in different studies. However, while you can pick and choose studies with poor outcomes, we have also illustrated studies in liver transplantation, Red Journal, JAMA, HBP, Mayo Clinic proceedings, et cetera, that support similar mortality and graft survival rates for well-selected elderly patients. There's also the matter of the donor pool, which is increasing in age. In liver transplantation in 2019, there was a paper stating that the donor pool is increasing for those 70 to 75. And if the donor pool is increasing in age, the recipient pool should also be looking at elderly as well for potential donor recipients. Additionally, I would like to emphasize that we are not saying everyone who is 70 or older should be listed for transplant. We are saying that those well-selected individuals, regardless of their age, should be considered. Currently, we have a 70-year-old male with excellent cardiovascular health. He was even able to complete a treadmill stress test, which many of our younger patients who are in the hospital cannot do. He has excellent family support, and he has no other significant comorbidities that are not well controlled. I believe if anyone had a family member or a loved one in this similar scenario, you would want options to extend their life and significantly improve their quality of life to be explored. Additionally, currently the MELD score does not look at frailty, and as my colleague Dr. Suchartlikitwong eloquently stated, we need to look at the overall physiologic age of patients, not the chronologic age of patients. Our 70-year-old patient may be 70 by his chronologic age, but I do not believe he is 70 by his physiologic age. Finally, I'd like to point out that as physicians, we took an oath to care for our patients. One essential tenet of our care includes equity. Our competitor is stating that we withhold a life-saving treatment for a very large and ever-growing portion of our population. I'd like to ask you, do you believe that this is fair? Dr. Suchartlikitwong and I do not believe so, and I would like to thank you for your time and consideration.
All right, so very heartfelt presentation. Thank you very much. And we finally have Dr. Baker back from the University of Utah to rebut the University of Arizona's position. Dr. Baker.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the team from Arizona. In response to their rebuttal, I would reiterate that the specifics of this case do not sufficiently provide enough support for a favorable long-term liver transplant. Furthermore, while the contrasting team has sufficiently debated that this patient may tolerate transplant, this assumes that the patient would be receiving a liver transplant soon. Given their current kind of health status, they would likely place low on the liver transplant list and would likely be in a declining state before they would be selected or offered an optimal kidney. While we could further debate as he continues to age on this wait list, his health will continue to decline, as I had mentioned, possibly putting him in a position where he wouldn't tolerate the risks of surgery. This reaffirms that the possible benefits of transplant would be comparable to simply just controlling his ascites and encephalopathy via medication. Furthermore, by doing so, it also considers the utility of our available organs. As we evaluate and debate this debate beyond our single patient, the need for selection criteria to balance patient equity and graft utility is paramount. By considering these two factors and determining possible transplant offers, we're maximizing the benefit of transplant for our region and our specific communities. So, where would this patient lie within our quest for utility and equity? Well, it's been very well detailed tonight. I believe that they carry too much risk, both preoperatively and postoperatively, to justify utilizing liver transplant. And while my colleagues are correct, there is benefit for liver transplant for this candidate. Is there enough current evidence to suggest their survival beyond 1 year would warrant utility, or even 5 years? I don't believe there is. To affirm this rebuttal, I will turn to the literature on 5-year survival in our patient's population pool. In a systematic review by a group of hepatologists here at the University of Utah, they deduced that the likelihood of 5-year survival in those over 70 was 48.9%, with a high level of confidence. This was compared to 70.1% for those under 70. In conclusion, age alone is not the absolute contraindication for liver transplant in well-selected candidates, that is. That being said, comorbidities attributable to older age should be well considered before beyond the other known diagnoses that a patient may carry. The published data on this topic affirms that notion. Specifically regarding our patient, their increased cardiovascular risk due to diabetes is significant enough in this situation. I'll uphold my argument that liver transplant in this patient would not be favorable to alternative solutions. Our allocation policy should continue to strive for a balance of utility and equity while questioning futility in our ever-changing population. With that, I'll kindly forfeit the remainder of my allotted time.
Well, thank you. That's excellent. Now we're going to move to the Q&A session, and I'm going to take the liberty of asking a question to each. So, firstly, a question for Nick Baker. So, a number of years ago, I sat through a very long movie called The Titanic, and after what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 6 or 7 hours into this movie, the ship finally sinks, and they say, women and children first to the lifeboats. Do you think they weren't precise enough, that they should have said young women and children first? Is that really the essence of your point, the utility issue here?
No, I'm glad that you're asking about this so we can kind of further articulate this. And I'm sure as my colleagues at Arizona will rebuttal, utility in these patients needs to be well selected. In this patient where he's had a history of diabetes, and we know that with a likely NASH cirrhosis syndrome, that his risk just is too strong. And so I believe that we should rely not necessarily on his MELD score because it's rather low, but just simply due to his diabetes and the cardiovascular risk that would follow.
Fair enough. And a question for the University of Arizona team, Dr. Zucker and Dr. Suchartlikitwong. Let's just say you had your 70-year-old patient and you had a mother of 25 with 3 young children. You have 1 liver. Would that have any bearing? Would you just give it to the highest MELD next, or do you think that the age would be a factor in that setting? You're going to create 3 orphans and see the mother off, or save the 70-year-old? What would your choice be?
I think that's a difficult question to answer, and I think that we need to know more about the candidates themselves prior to answering. I think everyone would want to say they would select the mother who has the 3 children. She has a much longer lifespan just being 25 if given the liver. However, if she has significant comorbidities, she could also still have severe heart disease. She could have diabetes, as it keeps getting pointed out, could make people higher risk for postoperative complications. We need to look at the best overall candidate regardless of their age. And while it is sad that she does have a family with young children, if she is not the better candidate, then she's not the better candidate. We need to consider all factors before making a choice.
That's very good. Dr. Manch, Dr. Chernoff, questions for our excellent debaters this evening, please.
Well, yes, I'll start with one. First, I'll start with just a personal experience of a 57-year-old man with no cardiac history, and cleared by angiography before liver transplant still had a heart attack on the table. So that's 57 years old. So that jades me just a little bit. However, seeing this particular patient's longevity in the family and how many more years are possible above the statistics, it makes me want to know more about the control of diabetes, lipids, blood pressure, and whether his clearance also included angiography, though I know that's imperfect. But I would say that I tend to agree with the physiologic assessment rather than the raw age data by itself. My question really relates to when you're dealing with this age group, it's not a question of what one judge thinks or one presenter thinks, but we usually have a group that meets and makes those decisions. So I think it takes an entire paradigm shift when we're dealing with this kind of patient. And I wondered if either one of our debaters or both would like to weigh in on any changes necessary by the group who makes that decision.
So I'm hearing a lot of silence. Well, Neil, I felt myself getting older while I was listening to your question. While they're thinking, let me ask each of the presentations were great. How would this case change if the patient, rather than having NASH with all its typical comorbidities which affect longevity, if the patient was, say, a female with PBC or autoimmune hepatitis, and likely would not have so many concerns about cardiovascular risk? Maybe not. Would that change? Does that change the argument in your mind? Either of you?
I'll be the first to respond to your question. And sorry if it's similar to Dr. Zucker, but we may need more information to really understand the patient and their risks. And I note that you had differentiated them. Where my presentation really focused on the cardiovascular risk, maybe the patient that you're bringing forward would be a more likely successful candidate for liver transplant. But that being said, I would love more information if that were the case.
And how about the Arizona folks? Any comments?
Yes. So during my presentation, I show a study as a multi-center cohort study looking at the etiology of like primary liver disease compare between NASH and non-NASH. And in the NASH group, they have more comorbidities, including cardiovascular, high blood pressure, hypertension, and diabetes. So, and they look at the 1 year and 3 years of survival and graft loss. There's no difference between these two groups significantly. So to answer your questions, I would say in the well-selected patient in the elderly group, I don't think there should be the main factor looking at in terms of liver transplant candidate.
Mike, I know you're from UK because 1976 was the 200th anniversary of the Union. 1776, and it's also the year I started practice, so it's hard for me to be totally objective with this discussion tonight, but great job.
I could chime in one more time as well. And
sure.
As I'm sitting here contemplating it, I think, our older patients with a lower MELD score and no metabolic diseases, they should really be, I think they would be considered good candidates, especially if they had a living donor, say, that kind of changes the game, I believe. And so there's, again, it relates back to we can offer liver transplantation in well-selected candidates.
Nick, would your surgeons be excited about a living donor in a 70-year-old NASH diabetic-y kind of patient?
I would hope that all four of them are here and would answer that for me, but I'm going to take the liberty of saying ask me tomorrow.
I'm going to get a little bit of squirming going on here. There's not been enough of it. And so I'm going to put the University of Arizona on a bit of a spot. So at the beginning, Dr. Suchartlikitwong said that age is just a number. Age is just a number. So let's change the number and say that number is now 80. Is age still just a number, or is age something more than that?
Oh, that's a very good question. So again, I still support my stand that age is just a number. And again, we have to look at the overall physiological age in terms of how fit they are, the body fitness, and other comorbidities. And then, like for this particular patient, they have the family history, like their father and mother, they live longer than normal population, like almost 100 years. So again, for 80 years old in the patients, a similar situation, if they tend to live another 10 years, that will be benefit from the liver transplant. I think we might need to consider it.
You know, I was watching an Oprah Winfrey show, and they asked the question to the audience, should a 95-year-old have access to heart transplantation? And everyone in the audience's hand went up as yes, which I think it showed a number of things about us as a society as much as it did about the wisdom of that kind of decision. But it's interesting, this is something that we deal with, and the public, I don't think, really understands that we're making these kind of decisions every day. Any last words, any last questions from Dr. Manch, Dr. Chernoff?
And yet, 30% of our population doesn't want to get a vaccine.
Oh, don't go there.
All right, very good.
Good job.
Before we move on, we remember this was a debate, and at the beginning, the great majority of the audience clearly sided with the proponents that this patient should probably be listed for liver transplantation. So the real question is not whether you agree with that position, but did the debate change your mind? So we're going to take 30 seconds, and the question is, have the presentations changed your mind as to whether or not this candidate should be offered liver transplantation? Not necessarily from a yes to a no, but have you moved? Has your position shifted? Very good. So it looks like the great majority, not great, 2/3 majority have not shifted, but a third have, and we're going to leave it up to the judges ultimately to decide the implications of that. So once again, thank you, and congratulations to both of you. So now while the judges are deliberating, I want once again to express our gratitude to our national sponsors for their support of tonight's academic debate, specifically the national gold sponsors, AbbVie and Eisai, our national silver sponsors, Salix, and of course our national bronze sponsors, Alexion, Mallinckrodt, and Pfizer. Thank you to all of you for making not just tonight possible, but for the great work of the ALF also possible. Now, there's another opportunity to donate tonight coming up. We're as grateful to our audience members who took a moment to donate. And if everyone would look in the Q&A box, you'll find the link to make your donation tonight, this evening. So please dip in there. Think of all the times you didn't go out in the last 2 years due to the pandemic, and return some of that to the ALF. Because one thing that did happen during the pandemic was liver transplantation for alcoholic hepatitis quadrupled, and it quadrupled in that time, and it's still increasing quickly. So the need for the good work of the ALF has increased substantially. Please do what you can to help support the ALF mission tonight. Now, while you're making your donation to such a worthy cause, I'm going to begin introducing debate number 2. Now, debate number 2 is really more of a discussion, but it's a discussion of probably the most active question in the whole of hepatology tonight. And it's going to be different than normal debates, and due to circumstances beyond the control of the organizers, it's a one-team debate, and really trying to see if our thinking can be changed by what is presented. And we're thrilled to have this team demonstrate their research and presentation skills. Now, the topic for this debate is assessment of NAFLD-NASH, biopsy versus non-invasive assessment in guiding management. And as you can see on the slide, there will be an 8-minute PowerPoint presentation followed by a 5-minute rebuttal supporting the non-invasive assessment position. And this debate will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A by our esteemed judging panel. And remember, there are at least 80 million people in the United States alone, 150 million between the United States and Western Europe with at least hepatic steatosis. So choosing who should get a biopsy versus who doesn't really need one is absolutely a key question. Now, the case study used for this debate is as follows. So this is a 65-year-old female, medically complicated, elevated BMI. BMI is 32, have type 2 diabetes, moderate alcohol use, which is not completely defined, but not an uncommon suggestion would be moderate, and hypertension. So referred to clinic due to persistent transaminase elevations. The workup is negative for viral hepatitis and also immune causes of liver disease. Computed tomography shows heterogeneous liver with smooth contour, no splenomegaly appreciated. The labs are shown here, not that remarkable. Hemoglobin 12.0, platelets a little bit on the low side, 180,000. No trend given, but a little bit low. INR 0.6, perhaps hypercoagulable. Total bilirubin's fine. Direct bilirubin also good. ALT 80, AST 147. So ALT a little bit lower than AST. Alkaline phosphatase normal. Iron is fine. Ferritin moderately elevated, 450. You don't see that more than 2 or 3 times in the morning. Total iron binding capacity, 254 micrograms per deciliter, saturation 78. Hemoglobin A1C, not very impressive adherence, reflecting 8.2%. Now, before I introduce our debate team for the second debate, we'd like you to take a look at the screen and participate in our poll again. Now, the question is, do you feel that a liver biopsy should be performed in patients with NAFLD, so at least hepatic steatosis and NASH? Or should liver biopsy be performed routinely in these patients? Yes or no? Vote your conscience, please. All right, so it looks like 77% said no, I think is a general approach. I think it's not, there should never be, but should be used judiciously or in a relative minority of patients. And a smaller percent said yes, this should be relatively routinely performed. So this is just a starting point. And now I'd like to introduce the debate team. So the Dignity Health St. Joseph's Hospital Medical Center team will be providing a presentation to help inform our subsequent thinking on this important topic. The Dignity Health team mentor is Dr. Justin Reynolds. Presenting for the Dignity Health team is Dr. Brett Hughes. The rebuttal will be presented by Dr. Ada Rosé. Dr. Hughes, please convince us that the best approach is a non-invasive assessment.
My name is Brett Hughes, and I will be arguing that non-invasive tests are a better diagnostic tool for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease than for biopsy. My colleague Ida Rosai will be providing the rebuttal later. So to summarize our points that we're going to be covering on why patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease should undergo non-invasive assessments, the first point I'm going to be arguing is that non-invasive methods are as good as liver biopsy in detecting advanced fibrosis, and that the presence of advanced fibrosis is what truly modifies our management and our recommendations for our patients. and that the distinction between NASH and NAFLD is less important for our patients' outcomes and how we treat them. I think the second point that we'll be arguing is that liver biopsy is a poor gold standard overall. It has issues with sampling errors, significant inter-observer variability, a high cost burden, as has been mentioned already, and a significant risk when we compare it with our non-invasive testing options. And so at the core of our argument, really what we're doing as physicians is trying to help our patients and modify their outcomes. That's really our goal with any type of treatments, and what we're doing, we're caring for our patients. And so our current recommendations for both NASH and NAFLD are the same. Those recommendations are weight loss via lifestyle management, such as diet and exercise, optimizing their cardiovascular risk factors, which are really these patients' most significant risks. They're more cardiovascular than anything liver. And so those factors include diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, and then avoiding heavy alcohol use as well. We also don't have any FDA-approved specific NASH treatments available. Two of the more promising ones that have come about in recent years are pioglitazone and vitamin E. However, neither of these drugs have shown any change in fibrosis. And even though pioglitazone showed improved inflammation on histology, clinical outcomes for those patients did not improve at all. And so if we look at our AASLD guidelines and recommended pharmacotherapy and surgery recommendations for patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, there's a few different drugs. So for metformin, there's no recommendations for treating NASH in adult patients. For our ursodeoxycholic acid, again, not recommended for the treatment of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. And bariatric surgery, one of the newer things that has been studied in more recent years, is also still considered premature to consider foregut bariatric surgery as an established option to treat NASH specifically. One of our more promising options that I think a lot of people were expecting to see approved because of this complete lack of any pharmacotherapy for our non-alcoholic fatty liver patients was obeticholic acid, because it did demonstrate some improvement in fibrosis in our phase 2 trials. However, it did not improve fat or inflammation. And as I mentioned already, cardiovascular disease is one of these biggest risks to our patients, and it actually showed a 20% increase in LDL cholesterol for these patients. And so when many of us were expecting them to see possible approval for this, the FDA instead requested additional analysis and continued evaluation of long-term outcomes, which is pretty surprising when you think about something that we have no pharmacotherapy for at all. To get back to my point of advanced fibrosis being the most important metric for our fatty liver patients, mortality is significantly higher for fatty liver patients with advanced fibrosis. And we have many serologic and imaging tests that are as good as liver biopsy at detecting advanced fibrosis. If we look at our table on our right here, you can see that the mortality for patients, especially the liver-related mortality, increases significantly with our stage 3 and stage 4 advanced fibrosis, whereas it's much lower in our earlier stages of fibrosis. To go over some of our different serologic methods we do have, we can break them down into simple and complex. Simple being labs that we would have just on basic routine labs that our patient would arrive with, our fibrosis score, our FIB4, the AST-ALT ratio, and the APRI. As you can see, the NFS has a very high specificity, a very good negative predictive value, and a very good positive predictive value for advanced fibrosis. Some of the newer things coming out are more complex tests, which are specific blood tests. Those are the ALF score, the FibroSure, the PRO-C3. The ALF score is a little bit more popular in Europe than it is here, but as you can see, it has very good values with a specificity of 98%, negative predictive value of 98%, and a positive predictive value of 87%. For our imaging methods that we have, there's quite a few options. Again, we have shear wave elastography, vibration-controlled transient elastography, more commonly known as FibroScan, and then we have magnetic resonance elastography. Again, all of these have very good sensitivity, specificity, and most importantly, very good at detecting advanced fibrosis. For our vibration-controlled transient elastography, it's up to 90% specificity for detecting advanced fibrosis. And one of the major complaints or counter arguments against it would be in our very obese patients. But we now have an extra large probe available that works on more than 95% of those patients, and a 99% negative predictive value for ruling out stage 4 fibrosis. For our magnetic resonance elastography, again, we have an accuracy of up to 98.5% in detecting advanced fibrosis. And those numbers are actually superior to liver biopsy. As you can see, all of the different guidelines across the world, in fact, have kind of embraced non-invasive testing. These are all of the different recommendations on how to test for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in patients with non-invasive methods, as well as continued follow-up for these patients, which, as we've mentioned already, there's many patients with this. This is going to be a major drain on the healthcare costs across the world. And so something as expensive as biopsy to monitor patients like this would be a major drain. Other benefits of our non-invasive testing, again, as I mentioned, cost is significantly lower. It's significantly easier to use than to obtain than a liver biopsy. Most of these are simple phlebotomy or simple imaging. We even have benefits such as with vibration-controlled elastography. Patients can actually have that performed while they're in the office with their clinician and actually obtain and discuss those results on the same day. These have a much faster turnaround than our pathology as well. If we go back to our patient, and I have our values here on the right, just to, in case you've forgotten, we can calculate some of our simple tests. I did assume a normal albumin in this patient. It may be low, which would even make this even a better score. But as you can see, all three of these have a very high specificity and positive predictive value for advanced fibrosis in this patient. And so my argument would be we have the answer here in front of us already. We have 3 separate scores all showing us that this patient very likely has advanced fibrosis. And I would argue we don't really need any further information at this point to be able to start making the treatment recommendations and care for this patient. For biopsy, which we consider the gold standard, I would argue that it's a very poor gold standard overall. And Dr. Rezai will be able to provide more information on that in our rebuttal. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ida Rezai, and I'll be discussing why liver biopsy should not be used as standard of care to assess for NASH. Liver biopsy has risks, it has sample variability, and is very costly, as discussed. And as Dr. Hughes mentioned, there's good data to suggest that non-invasive testing is just as accurate, is cost-effective, and allows for fibrosis monitoring over time. Some of the limitations to liver biopsy include bleeding, ascites, morbid obesity, and if the patient's just uncooperative, unable to get the liver biopsy. Some of the complications that can come with liver biopsy include pain, which has been reported in up to 80% of patients, and severe pain in up to about 20% of patients. Bleeding up to about 4.5%, and death up to 0.1%. Liver biopsy is limited by sample variability. In an article in 2005 that looked at about 51 patients with NAFLD who underwent 2 separate liver biopsy, there was a discordance rate for hepatocyte ballooning of about 18%, and for bridging fibrosis of about 35%. Additionally, hepatocyte ballooning would have been missed in about 20% of patients if they had only undergone 1 biopsy. So while we like to think that liver biopsy is representative of the entire liver, we know that the histologic features of NASH are unevenly distributed throughout the liver. Their liver biopsy is also limited by interobserver variability. There were 2 studies in 2014 and 2011 that demonstrated this. They demonstrated disagreements between some of the features of NASH, such as ballooning, intralobular inflammation, as well as fibrosis. And when looking at clinical trials that require specific histologic evidence of NASH, if we're only taking 1/50,000th of the liver and trying to include these patients, that biopsy may not include those features, and patients may be unnecessarily excluded from clinical trials that they otherwise would have benefited from. Dr. Hughes mentioned that liver biopsy is very costly. It can range anywhere from $2,000 to about $7,000, depending on if there's complications, hospitalizations. And as we know, with the US population having about a quarter of them having NAFLD, if we tried to biopsy everybody, that would be extremely costly and a great burden on the healthcare system, especially during a pandemic. Biopsy can additionally be impractical to use in clinical practice by primary care providers who are managing a lot of these patients as well. There was a survey in 2016 that took a look at about 152 physicians, and they reported that only a quarter of them had liver biopsies to diagnose NASH, and about 75% of them didn't. And even the referrals that they received for NASH, about half of them did not have liver biopsy diagnosing NASH. So this data suggests that we do need alternative methods in assessing for NASH and fibrosis in the outpatient setting. As discussed, liver biopsy can't readily be used to monitor for fibrosis, and that's why the FIB4 and NFS diagnostic tools can be used to assess for advanced fibrosis very accurately and can be used periodically in clinic as well. Dr. Hughes mentioned that MRE has an accuracy of up to 98.5% in detecting advanced fibrosis, which we know is very beneficial as mortality increases exponentially afterwards. And like he mentioned, there is now an X-large probe to address the question of obesity as a patient factor or a negative for non-invasive testing. Additionally, liver biopsy can not only be affected by sampling error, inter-observer variability is costly, has morbidity and mortality, but it's not practical to use this to monitor for progression. And again, while we like to think that liver biopsy is the gold standard, it may not be a good one because it's affected by so much variability. In our patients, they clearly have metabolic syndrome. And while there may be a role for liver biopsy if the diagnosis is unclear, I think in this patient, as clearly demonstrated by her scores, non-invasive testing was sufficient to diagnose her with fibrosis and NASH, advanced fibrosis and NASH. Thank you.
Well, that was excellent by both of you. Thank you, Dr. Rezai. It was really very helpful. It was interesting that as many as a quarter of respondents did think that liver biopsy would be worthwhile in a good proportion of cases. It was interesting that Kaiser Permanente not very long ago published their data with 2 million patients in that system. Only around 1% of patients in Kaiser Permanente system who carry an ICD 9 or 10 code for NASH or NAFLD have had a biopsy. So it's something that's not happening much. Dr. Manch or Dr. Chernoff, what are your thoughts? Has this changed your thinking on how you would practice when you get back to work tomorrow or whenever you're back to work, and a patient who's referred for ultrasound identified steatosis with these mild or moderate transaminase elevations? Start with Dr. Manch, please.
Okay.
I think it is changing. You know, for years we would say, since we don't have a specific therapy other than advising the patient the same whether you did a biopsy or not to exercise and lose weight, we tended to avoid biopsies. I think now in our practice, where we do have a very active clinical trial component, we reserve the liver biopsies mostly for patients in trials. And I think I kind of agree with the ASLD approach that if you're going to use a specific therapy like vitamin E or pioglitazone, you probably should have a biopsy to confirm that the patient has NASH. So, you know, as Mike put in the beginning, you know, liver biopsy on a routine basis is probably not yet and may never be appropriate. I think we're really trying hard to get away from liver biopsy. I think both presenters did an excellent job sort of framing the issues. And, you know, as we know, it's still up in the air. The FDA is kind of hung up on biopsies, so we're still doing them.
It's true. Dr. Chernoff, any thoughts on this or questions for Dr. Hughes, Dr. Rezai?
Yes, actually, I tend to agree. I use very little biopsies nowadays. I try to get my information by non-invasive means. However, this particular case seems unclear to me. Is it just NAFLD or maybe MAFLD now? is there an alcohol component that's more significant than we think? And what about those funky iron studies? This is a case I might actually biopsy, and I'm not a big biopsier. I would like to know if you take away the assessment of fibrosis out of the picture, would either of these fellows biopsy just to make a good diagnosis?
Start with Dr. Hughes. What are your thoughts on that, please? Are you happy without a biopsy in this case, or setting aside the general principles of biopsying and not biopsying in this context, but this particular patient, given the iron studies that were mentioned, transaminase ratios, are you happy with that one in this case? You're on mute.
Still muted.
I don't think that biopsy is never the answer, definitely. And in this patient, with the kind of murky alcohol history, we have the luxury of being able to say that stopping alcohol abuse is the answer for NAFLD, or if it was alcohol induced. And I would say for the liver or for the iron studies, they do kind of muddy the waters a little bit. I think if we could pursue some hemochromatosis gene testing and kind of clarify things there a little bit, because again, we think biopsy is going to be a perfect answer, and it's definitely going to be correct. But when we kind of look at the literature, there's a good chance we miss it. There's a good chance that the pathologists that we get may be incorrect, and the next best pathologist may disagree. So I think there's maybe something, I think we may trust biopsy a little too much in some cases. And so I think there's some non-biopsy ways we could help clear things up, and we may get our answer there without ever needing it.
Good. It's interesting, the Food and Drug Administration's liver chief, Dr. Frank Anania, he pointed out that liver biopsies are really just a biomarker for risk, not so much, they don't really care that much about histology, especially who's at risk for liver-related events or mortality. And there are studies like the ones you discussed, and now the enhanced liver fibrosis or ALF test that actually predicts risk better than liver biopsy. So I think the use of biopsy is much more to figure out where you're really not sure about maybe F3 versus F4, or really more importantly, the cause of liver disease. I think that's probably its best utility at this point. Any other questions or thoughts from Dr. Chernoff, Dr. Manch? Questions for the team?
One other thought, because the patient's platelet count isn't low, I think we're getting away from things like EGDs for varices in people whose platelet counts are greater than 150,000. So I'm not, again, as concerned in this particular patient about how advanced the disease is. I'm sure it is advanced fibrosis, but I just don't know what her diagnosis is. And that disturbs me some. I agree with getting hemochromatosis genetic studies. That's an easy, simple thing to do. But
do you have any rebuttal for that, or not rebuttal, but response to that? Do you think this patient is adequately worked up at this point to be sent for consideration of metabolic therapy, maybe with the GLP-1 receptor agonist, a weight loss clinic, and a nutritionist?
I still would agree that I think that's the right decision, and I don't think we need a liver biopsy. She's got a lot of risk factors for metabolic syndrome, essentially hypertension, obesity, diabetes, and ferritin levels can be, it's an acute phase reactant, so it can be elevated for numerous reasons. And the moderate alcohol use, while you can maybe better quantify it, I think that she has so many risk factors for NAFLD and NASH that would be the most likely diagnosis. And I think that I would feel comfortable in not biopsying her for those reasons.
All right. And Brett, do you agree?
I do, yeah. The pretest probability is certainly in our favor for fatty liver.
Okay, very good. We had a colleague of mine, Keith Linder, collected about 100 patients where the diagnosis wasn't clear. All the viral, autoimmune, and other studies were negative, and they got a biopsy anyway. The yield on a firm diagnosis on those patients was less than 5%. The biopsy actually doesn't usually inform you that much more. So I think your approach is sound based on those now very aging and unlikely to be repeated data. All right, well, on that note, we're going to move forward. I'm going to thank again Dr. Rofaiel and Dr. Hughes for an excellent and succinct presentation.
Thank you very much for having us.
Now, before we conclude our program, I'd like to congratulate all of our teams on an outstanding job they've done tonight, and to thank their mentors. I know from participating in these, an awful lot of work goes into it for some time before the event itself. I'd like to thank the judges for their thoughtful participation and insights today, the ALF tech team, of course, and to thank you for joining us this evening. It's been an excellent night, and my hope is that we look back in 5 years and look at this as really a tremendous start to what will become an increasingly vigorous and well-attended part of the year for people who love the liver, hepatophiles across the Mountain West region. Now, before we conclude, we should once again thank and acknowledge our sponsors, the National Gold sponsors, AbbVie and Eisai, the Silver sponsors, Salix, and the National Bronze sponsor, Alexion, Mallinckrodt, and Pfizer. Now, this is yours and our final opportunity to donate and support the ALF tonight. So please be generous. Please help the ALF reach this important goal of $5,000 tonight. It's hard to imagine what our lives would be like in the liver world without an institution or group like the ALF. I think so much would be different. So please dig deep if you can and support ALF. The link has just been posted for your convenience. While you're making your donation, we'd like to begin to make closing comments to all of our mentors and debaters that will join us for the final results of the evening and the announcement of the winner of the great debate. Now, there are some upcoming academic debates, the Rocky Mountain debates, November 9th, the Greater Pennsylvania, November 30th, and the Greater DC, December 2nd. Thanks to the wonders of the web, you can attend these as well. And also Michigan, December 9th, and future debates, hopefully your team. Now, the ALF has many resources for the patients, including a helpline, and we offer exceptional educational programs to our healthcare professionals. Please visit the links that are posted here this evening. There's an awful lot on offer, and please encourage your patients to visit as well. Engaged patients are the best. So please remember to visit the website and to recommend it to your friends, family, colleagues, and patients. And please use our social media shown here to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram. And now the moment everyone has been waiting for, and the winners are, drum rolls, the University of Arizona. So congratulations to the University of Arizona, to all of our participants and mentors. And of course, Dignity Health were born winners here as a pure proponent group. So well done, and thank you to everyone.